Thank you. It's really great to be here. And I don't think I'd get choked up, but I'm glad I did, actually. So they've given me 2 hours, and I'm going to use it all. So buckle up. We've got a lot to talk about. I don't know where I want to start. I got slides, so I can just follow my slides, I suppose. But, you know, I think we're all just in a state of amazement. I mean, absolute shock and amazement at where this entire UFO culture and community and public discourse has gone in the last few years. I can tell you for myself in 2015, 2016, not that long ago, I had not the slightest idea that what we're living through would happen. And I'm not saying that we're coming to disclosure, because I actually don't think that we are. But we are moving in a direction that's quite fascinating. And we want to pay close attention because we're in a place that we've never been. And we're going to places that we don't, we're going to have a wild ride here. So I've titled this Disclosure Outlook, where we are, what's missing, and what's likely. The first thing I guess I'll talk about is a little bit of history. That's what I do most of the time. Although actually I think a lot about the future these days, and I'll have a few things to say about that too, but I guess I think about the past. And when I look back on the past of ufology, I think that we may be able to say that 1947 to 2017 is a unit. It's a period that's got a sense of coherence to it. I'll call it 70 years of denial. You start with Kenneth Arnold, Roswell in 1947. And, during that entire period, right up until 2017, if you were to ask the government about UFO truth and what have you, the answer would be relatively the same throughout that entire period, which is that, nope, there's nothing like that. We're not interested. We don't do that. There's, if you see something, maybe you see an experimental something or other, but you're not seeing aliens. There's no evidence, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to go through a little bit of that history. Because frankly, in the conversations that we're having these days, the history has just been siphoned out. There's no history in the conversation about UAP, aka UFOs. UFOs having been rebranded as UAP, and that's okay. You want to rebrand it, be my guest, but at least don't take out the history. So I just want to remind us, because we've, those of us in this community, all these years, we've known the history. And now that the rest of the world is hearing about UAP, they don't know any of the history, and they're not being told any of the history. But what happened starting in 1947 is that this nation had a revolution, national security revolution. Not our last. We had one in 2001, and we had one last year. But in 1947, we had a big one, and it was a lot of things. It was a reorganization of the national security establishment. So we got, CIA, we got an independent Air Force, we got a National Security Council, and on top of that, we got deepened manipulation by the intelligence community of many, many important institutions of this society, such as the media. It's not that there wasn't communication and cooperation before, but in the 1940s and 50s, it just got crazy. So some of you have heard of Operation Mockingbird, and if you haven't, you should know what that is, but essentially that's CIA getting its hooks inside of all of American media, and not just influencing it, but often controlling it. Literally creating fake news often. If you want to overthrow foreign governments, say Guatemala in 1954, you just plant fake stories in the press, get people worked up, and you justify your coup. And they did that many times. We talk about fake news. Well, the biggest purveyors of fake news is the United States intelligence community. They're the ones, and they work through the big organizations, of course. And they did it back then. And that really took off in a big way in the 40s. Ditto with academia. Forget that one a lot. There's a good book I read many years ago called Cloak and Gown by a historian named Robin Winks, I believe. He's gone, but that was a good study of the relationship of the CIA with Yale University, kind of the revolving door of recruitment out of Yale and of the Ivy League in general. But it goes far, far beyond that. There's a true revolving door of the intelligence and national security state with the world of the upper echelon of academia. Well, that's kind of important. There's a lot of influence there. And there's a lot of guard dogs and watchdogs positioned strategically within those institutions to keep younger scholars in line if they step out. And for many years, of course, that worked perfectly within the UFO field, but it was a Harvard astronomer, Donald Menzel, the most prominent UFO debunker for a long time. Look, if you were some young academician back in those days and you wanted to get out of line and talk about this, Menzel would just smack you down. Who's going to fight a Harvard astronomer on UFOs? No one. By the way, Menzel, of course, as we now know, had deep connections to the NSA. No one knew that at the time. And, control over politics, control over culture, all of this got very, very deep in the 1940s and beyond. So that was the revolution. And at the same time, here's the thing, the UFO phenomenon comes, boom, right into the laps of the world in the 1940s, but it didn't come into a vacuum. It came into a world in which the United States had gone through this transformation into something that it had never been before, which is really a formal corporate empire. And that's the group that had to handle this problem. And so what did they do? What did they do? They just denied. That's a New York Times piece right after Roswell when they put that whole thing to bed. So they're denying UFOs, but what was behind the curtain? So I'm just going to go through a very small number of quotations from my favorite part of ufology, which are declassified government documents. That's what got me in the beginning all those years ago. And I still think we can't lose sight of the important statements that were made back in the early years. So this is actually from, the very famous statement by General Nathan Twining in September 23rd, 1947. Twining was a 3-star general at the time. He later became a 4-star general and chief of staff of the U.S. Air Force. And in 1947, he's answering a question from another general, Charles Shulgin, who's saying, hey, what about these flying discs? Are these a thing that I got to worry about or not? Is this something that we're doing? What's the deal, General? And Twining writes back a secret memo to Shulgin, and he says a few things. One is, the phenomenon is something real and not visionary or fictitious. Now, that was classified at the time. But could you imagine if that had gotten out to the public in 1947, when the Air Force is playing this little game of pretend that this is all fictitious hallucinations and so forth. But here's Twining saying, no, it's real. Our reports are telling us it's real. He describes in these reports what military pilots and military personnel are reporting relating to these encounters and describing extreme rates of climb, maneuverability, and action, which must be considered evasive when sighted. So they're intelligent, and they've got extraordinary capabilities. Again, we're talking 1947. He goes on, metallic or light reflecting surface. So they're getting good visuals of these things. And my favorite, circular or elliptical in shape, flat on bottom, and domed on top. What in God's name is going to be flat on bottom and domed on top with incredible maneuverability in 1947, evading U.S. interceptors? Well, that's the question. Here's another document from Kirtland Air Force Base, 1949, late January. Back at that time, there was something known as the green fireball phenomenon. It was going all throughout, well, not all throughout New Mexico, but in a north-south trajectory up in north and south of Albuquerque. This got the military and military scientists extremely worked up, like to the point, I wouldn't say of panic, but of, let's say, extreme concern. These objects were coming in very, very controlled, low, obviously maneuverable. No one knew what the heck these things were. And it prompted ongoing classified meetings of high-level military people and scientists. And this one this is like one drop in the bucket, says sighting of identical objects, talking about a previous one, by approximately 30 people, estimate at least 100 total sightings at that point. Goes on. AEC, AFSWP, 4th Army local commanders, perturbed by implications of phenomena. I love that phrase. By the way, the AEC and the AFSWP were all nuclear, so the AEC became the Department of Energy, and AFSWP was, what is that? Oh, Armed Forces Special Weapons Project. So after the Manhattan Project ended, that became this organization, which was in charge of all military control over nuclear technology. That's basically what that was. They don't exist now, but. So you've got a lot of nuclear concern about this, and you think about nukes in the late 40s, there was nothing more important in terms of weapons and technology. In fact, at this particular time, America still had a monopoly of nuclear weapons. The Soviets were fast on the track, and they would get their first nuke detonated later that year. But I guess my point here is that these very important organizations were perturbed, there's a good word, by the implications of the phenomena. Well, you let your imagination run. Around the same time, an FBI was following this entire development in the Southwest and was reporting on it as well. And this is a long, long memo. It's a couple of pages long. It gives a lot of description of objects moving in multiple thousands of miles per hour at high altitude, great maneuverability. Again, in 1949. Here's just a statement where it says, this matter is considered top secret by intelligence officers of both the Army and the Air Force, or Air Forces. Back then, they sometimes pluralized it. So again, you get the idea that's very, very significant. This is a, this is a good, interesting memo as well. This is an Army memo describing some crazy shenanigans over the Hanford Atomic Energy Commission site. So Hanford in the state of Washington, that was the first place in the world where they were processing plutonium, ever. It's highly toxic, lots of nuclear waste there, it's a mess. But this was another place where there was tremendous UFO activity. And these people, no one knew what to do about it. So this is what it says. Since July 30th, objects round in form have been sighted over the Hanford AEC plant. These objects were above 15,000 feet in altitude. See, listen to this part. Air Force jets attempted interception with negative results. All units, including the anti-aircraft battalion, radar units, Air Force fighter squadrons, and the FBI have been alerted for further observation. The Atomic Energy Commission states that the investigation is continuing and complete details will be forwarded later. Wow. Fighter squadrons. Can you imagine if that memo had gotten released accidentally or intentionally in 1950? Of course, all of these were classified. No one knew about them. And by the way, that last statement, the investigation is continuing and further details will be forwarded. Well, we don't have any of that. It just shows that, freedom of information is nice, but it's not a magic bullet, and there's a lot of documents that we've never gotten and probably will never ever get. They're probably all destroyed. But yes, quite significant and quite concerning for those people running the show. This is a statement from my personal favorite document to quote probably in all of the UFO literature. This is a CIA document. It was written to the director of the CIA by his assistant director of scientific intelligence, a man named H. Marshall Chadwell. So we're talking December 1952, after a big, big year of absolutely just shocking UFO sightings. Civilian, military, it was just an incredible year. And this is what Chadwell says to his boss, CIA Director Walter Beadle Smith. He says, at this time, reports of incidents convince us that there is something going on that must have immediate attention. Sightings of unexplained objects at great altitudes and traveling at high speeds in the vicinity of major U.S. defense installations are of such nature that they are not attributable to natural phenomena or known types of aerial vehicles. What else is he going to say? Boss, I think we're being invaded? I mean, it's pretty much putting it right out there. And these are extreme levels of concern, you can see. And this is just a smattering of the FOIA documentation that has come down to us. And by the way, I'll just point out, when these documents were crafted back in those years, none of the authors of these documents had any idea of expectation that they would one day be in the public domain. And the only reason that they did is because we had the Freedom of Information Act passed years later. It was originally passed in 1966, but without the teeth that it needed for us. So it really got those teeth at the very end of Richard Nixon's presidency, right before he went out. Watergate, of course, took him down. But at the very end, Congress, Nixon signed it, strengthened the Freedom of Information Act. And what happened as a result of that was simply I don't think they expected this, but UFO researchers went charging full speed ahead. They were out in front of everyone else doing FOIA requests in the 70s. That's the truth. And thousands of pages of documents. It's like shake the tree and see what falls out. And a lot of documents came out. And this was one of the ones that I've just showed you, are some of them, but there's many others. So I want to talk about a little bit more of the history before we get into the present moment. And this is one of my personal UFO heroes. That's Leonard Stringfield. I never had the pleasure to meet Leonard Stringfield. He died in 1994, just when I was getting started in researching this subject. But he was an amazing, amazing human being, and we are all lucky to have had him. Why? Because it was Leonard Stringfield, more than anybody else, even more than Stanton Friedman, who was very important, but Stringfield more than anyone, who opened up the entire subject of acquired, exotic, i.e. alien technology. And actually, before I get into that, I'll just explain. So Stringfield, got a little dizzy there. Stringfield was, let's talk about him. He was in the Second World War. In fact, he had a UFO sighting at the end of the Second World War in the Pacific. That was kind of interesting. He was a UFO investigator going back to the 1950s, but he really hit his stride in the 1970s and 80s. He lived in Cincinnati, Ohio, not too far from Air Force headquarters in Dayton. So Stringfield was the perfect person to do what he did. He was in the right location. He had the military background, so military people trusted him to a large extent. He was just a decent human being. He was very likable, and he was very meticulous. He had obvious integrity. And so people started to come to him, but they started to do that because in 1976, we had a presidential candidate named Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter was unique in that he was the first presidential candidate to admit that he'd seen a UFO. You know, it was very shocking at the time, and he was governor of Georgia back in 1969 with a group of people, and they saw something that was quite unusual. And Carter, by the way, you know, he's never stated, I know it was an alien craft. He's never given an opinion on that, but it was interesting, and he even filed a report to NICAP, UFO group. So because of that, a number of people got kind of excited. And Carter was asked at one point when he was running, will you open up the UFO files? And Carter's answer was, well, yes. I mean, as long as it doesn't harm national security, but I will do everything that I can. And that was kind of an amazing thing to hear at that time. And so there was this hope among many people that Jimmy Carter would be the disclosure president. Not that anyone was using that term back then, they weren't, but that's really what they were hoping for. So in that context, Stringfield wrote a book in which he had one sliver of the book toward the end where he talked about something UFO researchers never did, or hardly ever did, which was a couple of interesting crash retrieval events. And he put it in there. And because of that, because of the Carter phenomenon, Stringfield started getting people coming up to him with the expectation that, well, the president's going to come out and make an announcement sometime, so we're just going to tell you what we know. And he collected 5, and then 10, and then 20, and then like 100 different accounts or more of different aspects of UFO crash retrieval. Stringfield was like this amazing clearinghouse of these events, of these stories. And these are just some. This is a small amount. I'm not even going to read through these, but the basic pattern is, you know, one person would say, yeah, I did a security detail at Wright-Patterson back in 1966, whatever, and for a brief period, I had to guard 9 bodies that sure looked like tiny little aliens. Or maybe a wife would say, yes, when my husband was alive, he told me about this particular crash retrieval event that he had known about. Or someone else would come up, and there were a lot of people doing security details that came to Stringfield. One guy actually came up with an early version of almost what you could say an alien autopsy thing. It wasn't an autopsy, but he had worked at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey in 1953. He came up to Stringfield and said, yeah, back then I was pulled into a military theater, and I had to sit down and I watched this film where there's like this desert scene, and there's a tent, and there's all these people running around, and inside the tent are these dead aliens. And we're watching this for a little while, and the lights in the movie theater went up, and we all told to get out. 2 weeks later, an officer came up to me on the base and said, "That film you saw, forget it, it was a hoax." And this guy never knew what that was about. Strange. I wonder if he failed a recruitment. You know, you really wonder. I mean, if you're running a UFO retrieval program, you're looking for new people, you may have to examine them and see how they react to extreme situations and information. Maybe this guy failed the test. In any case, lots and lots and lots of these stories, and Stringfield just collected them all. I'm going to tell you a detail on 2 of them. This is one. The Blue Room. Now, rumors of a Blue Room at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, but this wasn't at Wright-Pat. I don't know where this was, somewhere in the Southwest. So the story is, Stringfield, and he had a very good source on this. He wrote he was very confident of this source, so okay. And what he learns is that there was a military guy with high scientific qualifications who was told, get into this airplane, we're taking you somewhere. Gets a hood put on his head. All these other guys, they all have hoods put on their faces. They can't see where they're going. They're led out. They go, it's hot desert sand. He could make that part out. And they're being brought into a large, very large hangar. They take the hoods off, they're inside, and everything inside the hangar is painted blue, like the walls, the floors, ceiling, everything is blue. And there's tables and cabinets, shelves everywhere. And on the shelves and such are artifacts, which are not blue. I think they probably painted the room blue so you could just not lose anything, like everything's easily visible. Anyway, thousands of artifacts, very exotic, and they were told, I'll just read this. This is Stringfield writing. They were to study each object and determine its purpose, operating parameters, and whether or not it could be duplicated. So this guy is conversing with the curator, I guess we could say, of this hangar. And he and a few other gentlemen are brought to a back room where there are 4 tanks, like huge aquarium tanks with this pink liquid, and in the liquid are suspended alien beings. Small, look like gray aliens. This is what he said, that's his story. Now, I mean, we were not there to get the story, but Stringfield found it credible. It's just, you know, another drop in the bucket, throw it in the pile. The other one I just want to mention for Stringfield is his account of Dr. X. So one of Stringfield's people was a doctor who worked at a large medical establishment on the East Coast of the United States. And he got to know this guy pretty well, in person, in fact, including at the man's place of work. So this was a very good relationship that Leonard Stringfield had with this man. And he obviously knew his name and so forth, but he called him Dr. X to protect his identity. And this doctor told Stringfield that he had performed autopsies or autopsy-like procedures on alien bodies. And he wrote a report and he summarized the physiology of these beings, describing them almost exactly as you would describe a gray alien. About 4 feet tall, very lightweight, big heads, and so forth. Heavy brow ridge, that's one thing that doesn't quite stand out when you think of a gray alien. But I don't know what to make of that. But there have been variations that have been described of alien beings, and not all exact identical grays. And there are variations, and that's what this doctor apparently saw. No reproductive organs. He suspected they were androids, artificial creations of some sort or another. And then actually after Stringfield and this doctor got to know each other a bit, the doctor broke off all communication, and just his last thing to Stringfield was, he said, "Can't talk to you anymore. The higher-ups found out that I'm discussing this with you, and I got my knuckles smacked." Basically, some disciplinary action, and he had to stop. So there you go. Oh yes, this is, if you really want to read an amazing, amazing UFO publication, that is Leonard Stringfield's 7 collected status reports, that's what he called them. You know, when he was writing these back in the 70s and 80s and the early 90s, I think there was almost no circulation. It was a tiny little MUFON UFO community. Probably sold a couple of 100 copies of each one of these. They're incredible. So someone put them all together as a big fat book. It's almost 400 pages, 8.5 by 11. It's very large. It's $80 on Amazon. It's not cheap, but I will tell you, if you are actually interested in this information, it is absolutely worth every penny. It's not available as an ebook, unfortunately. It would be nice, but it is a big paperback, and I can tell you I've gone through it over and over and over again. It's incredible. And I'm glad someone put that all together. So, okay. I'm not going to do any more history. What we can say, though, of that 70-year period that I was talking about, up to 2017, is, what have UFO researchers concluded, generally speaking, about this subject? Well, I would say the conclusion is it's real and they're here, whoever the they are is. We can get into that. We can say that there were countless large numbers of military engagements throughout the decades, and not just the United States. Every nation with a significant military has had these encounters all over the world. And even more well-attested, well-documented accounts by ordinary people. And many of them were incredibly well-documented. Slam dunk cases, many of them. We can also say that there were crash retrievals and, let's say, other types of acquisition of UFO tech, because they may not necessarily have all been crash retrievals. It's not necessarily clear. You get hints every now and then that there were other methods of acquiring these things, and I don't know the exact specifics, but it's a possibility. We can definitely say, and there's been, myself among other people have looked into the secrecy around this, and certainly we can say that it was massive and deep. Labyrinthian is a word I like to use to describe it. We can say that there have been abductions. Yes, I think absolutely we can say that. As well as other forms of encounters with these beings. We could say that whoever they are, they're everywhere. They are everywhere. And this is, again, something that I don't hear a lot about in the UFO research field. In other words, no one seems to care about sighting reports anymore. Everyone's like, we've been there, done that. Yeah, we know that they're here. Who needs to look at sighting reports? Well, here's why you got to look at sighting reports, because if you study them, here's one thing you learn. You learn that there are thousands upon thousands of pretty decent sightings recorded every single year around the world, and in your neighborhood, probably over your house at 2 or 3 in the morning. You taking a selfie here? Look at Shameless. Sir, have you no shame? That was fun. That was a line, by the way, I took from the McCarthy hearings, if any of you are onto that. That was the line that took Senator Joe McCarthy down. Have you no shame, sir? So where was I? Oh, yeah. So, here's the thing that blows my mind when I think about these sightings. They're over your house, at 3 in the morning. You go to the National UFO Reporting Center. You can read the reports there. One place that is still going are Filer's Files. George Filer, God bless that man. We still have him. And he still puts out these incredible summations and reports of UFO activity. He's a great guy. Anyway, you can find, people will report the same thing over and over. It's 2 in the morning, couldn't sleep. I go outside, have a cigarette. I'm looking at the stars, and I see this low black triangle, not always a triangle, saucer-shaped object, whatever, 500 feet over the houses, just gliding. Almost couldn't see it. What is that? You go through this and you see this many times. Someone is skulking about around the world. This isn't just United States or North America. It's everywhere. So what is that? Who's doing that? Is that a black budget classified special access program? Well, if so, they're doing a worldwide operation over your house. And I don't hear anything about that. But clearly, it indicates to me that we're talking big infrastructure, lots of money, or the equivalent of money, and serious intent, and also an extreme commitment to secrecy and clandestine activity. And there's only one thing that I'm able personally to think about what they could be doing at 3 in the morning over your house, which is an abduction. I can't think of anything else. going over residential neighborhoods. Well, I mean, they're doing other things than that, but that's one thing that they're doing seemingly all the time. That's another thing I think researchers learn. And then the last thing I have on this list is there a breakaway science or a breakaway civilization? And that's a phrase that I coined in one of my books over a decade ago, and just a theory that I worked out of, extreme levels of secrecy. What happens if you've got a classified program that's got some scientific breakthroughs and you don't want to share the breakthroughs with the rest of the world? Well, you wouldn't stop your scientists from continuing onward with that if they developed some kind of anti-grav or some kind of new energy system or some other exotic world-shaking, world-changing technology. You're not just going to let that loose. No way. But you're also going to have your scientists in the classified world continue that, and they eventually end up developing their own cosmology, perhaps, and maybe their own replicas that can take them off-world and learn things that the rest of us poor slobs stuck down on the planet are never going to get a chance to learn unless we find a way out. So anyway, this list, I don't know, there's more that I could add in here, but I would say that at least in the UFO research field, through 2017, through today really, these are some pretty good conclusions that I think are generally well agreed on. And all that time, all of those conclusions were ignored, completely ignored by the establishment-controlled culture, establishment-controlled media. You couldn't have a conversation about this with any level of maturity or sophistication because you just get shut down. And yet this unbelievable discrepancy existed. You talk about signs of a sick society. You got the most important thing going on. Like, what's more important than the arrival of some intelligence that's so far beyond anything we're supposed to have, and you can't talk about it? And furthermore, people would experience this usually on their own, totally isolated, because you don't have ridicule. And so now you experience this either trauma or sometimes elation or whatever it is, the most amazing thing you ever see in your life, and you talk about this to no one much of the time, or maybe a couple of friends. And one of the typical things you find with UFO sightings is people have these extraordinary events happening to them, and they don't talk about it, and they just tuck it away in the little back of their mind, and they forget about it themselves sometimes because they don't know how to process it, because it's just like blows their paradigm, their reality, right out of the water. That's a trauma to me. Like, that's bad for us. And it's also bad because when you have this incredible thing happening, I think the worst way to deal with it is everyone's in their own little private Idaho that can't talk to each other. We're atomized. That's not a good way to do this, it seems to me. But we have an official culture that is so tightly controlled that we were not able to do it. But in 2017, it seems that, well, let's call it a breakthrough. Certainly a significant change. And that was, of course, December 16th, 2017. And you get two articles in the New York Times, which is, the Pravda of the United States, like the official mouthpiece of the established powers that be. They put out two actually decent, not embarrassing articles on UFOs. And of course, one in Politico by Brian Bender. And those three articles came out, and what did they do? They said to the world, yeah, actually the Pentagon did have a UFO study program quite recently called ATIP. And all of us in the UFO field were like, what? I mean, we were partly elated and feeling vindicated, and partly I think we were just annoyed at, being lied to for all those years. But at least the lie came out. I mean, honestly, ATIP is it's aptly named, the acronym's apt because it's the tip of a massive iceberg, of course. I mean, they're talking about, yeah, we spent $22 million on ATIP for those years. That's like probably the Pentagon spent more money on coffee than $22 million. But anyway, it was nice to know that they did that, and it was an admission. It was an important admission. And then the other article that came out at that time, of course, was the Tic Tac encounter. And we learned about Commander David Fravor and that extraordinary event, and it is extraordinary. It's not the most extraordinary UFO encounter, actually, but it's a good one, and it's very well attested. So it's definitely, now we could say, a historically strong UFO encounter. So that was the breakthrough. And so what I want to run by you here is that since the end of 2017, We have had, in the last 3.5 years, an extraordinary number of like headline bombshells relating to UFOs that we'd never had anything like this before 2017. And now we had there's like 20 of them here, basically. So, you know, starting in October 2017, you got the TTSA press conference. That really kicked the whole thing off. And that was quite significant. Yeah, they had the Mylar balloon thing. They made their mistakes. But you have a significant group of individuals with very impressive backgrounds. They went on the record, and no one said the word UFO, but it was all about UFOs. And no one was saying, oh, UFOs are real, but what they were saying is UFOs are real. That was a TTA press conference. And as a result of that, you get Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal and Helene Cooper for the New York Times doing the articles 2 months later. My take on that is really all Leslie and Ralph. I'll talk about that in a minute. But they put their articles out, then you get the release of the 38 titles of the scientific papers from the ATIP program. That's all Hal Puthoff. That's a fascinating thing. I don't really have time to get into it here, and then all these other things, Puthoff talking on the metamaterial in June of 2018. Holy God, that was unbelievable. If you're not familiar with that, look it up on Vimeo. It's a heck of a lecture. Hal was shocked that it was on Vimeo. I think I told him. He's like, oh, wow. What did he do? So there was this artifact. It's called the metamaterial. And it's kind of amazing. Came to Art Bell many years ago in the 90s. Linda Moulton Howe curated it for a long time. She sent it out to different people, including Hal Puthoff and others, and they studied it. And what he was saying at this lecture was, this thing is manufactured in a way that we have no idea how anyone could have done it. You're talking nano-level layers of bismuth and magnesium in such a way. He said, you know, when we first looked at this, we had no idea what this could even be for. And he said, but you know, time passes and we kind of figured a few things out. And he described it as, how did he say? As a highly effective waveguide for high-frequency radiation, electromagnetic radiation, terahertz range, I think he said. And I was like, what the hell does that mean? I had to look it up. So a waveguide means like a canal is a waveguide for water. So this is a waveguide for high-frequency radiation. I think light, maybe I'm getting it wrong. Then I listened to a lecture or an interview by Jack Sarfati, who's kind of a crazy genius in my opinion. And he's talking about this metamaterial, and his take on it was quite interesting in my opinion. And he said, yeah, what I think is that the lattice-like structure in the metamaterial, which no one knows how to manufacture it yet because we don't have the capability, and we don't. We're not down at the angstrom level when we make these things. But anyway, he said, what I think that this does is it slows the speed of light down. And I couldn't explain the math or crunch the numbers for you and tell you why, but that's what his opinion is. And so if you slow the speed of light down, then you're changing all the equations of the amount of energy necessary to soften the space-time bubble around the craft. So what I think he was saying is that this material, the skin of the craft, can make it much easier for you to create a kind of space-time bubble around you, so that, well, that's what you get, you know, the warp field equations from. You know, Miguel Alcubierre 30 years ago came up with the math for warp speed, like on Star Trek. The only problem is to create that space-time bubble, the amount of energy you needed would be like more energy than exists. It's too much. But if you change the equation, you slow light down. According to Sarfati, he said, maybe a AAA battery would be enough energy to do that. You know. Anyway, I'm getting off track here. All the bombshells, all of this stuff is just amazing. New York Times comes out in May 2019 with another article by Leslie and Ralph on the USS Roosevelt. That's heavy duty. That's I think their best article that they did for the Times. That's my opinion. Navy makes an admission saying, yeah, we do get these UAP, these UFOs, and we've just updated our guidelines for dealing with them. Can you imagine if that had been said 10 years ago or 20 years ago? The world would be flipping out. We would have. Something changed. We're not flipping out. I mean, it's interesting. And then Elizondo goes on Tucker Carlson on May 31st, 2019. That just blew my mind. You know, Carlson at the end says, so have we gotten any of these craft at all? And Elizondo is at first saying, well, you know, Tucker, my NDAs prevent me from saying anything. Pause. But yes. End of interview. What? He just said there were crash retrievals and acquired exotic tech on national TV. And no one said anything about it after the fact. Like, my God, that's talk about a bombshell. A week after that, the Wilson Davis notes leaked out. I was part of that whole thing. And yes, it is criminal negligence by the rest of the UFO community that they do not examine these documents the way they should. It's absolutely, I can't understand it. Some of you don't know what I'm talking about. So very, very, very brief summary. Back in 1997, Stephen Greer was making the rounds in Washington, D.C. He had Dr. Edgar Mitchell with him, Navy Commander Will Miller, and other people. And he's talking to anyone, I think, who's willing to listen about deep black special access programs in which alien tech was being reverse engineered. And he had information about it. Turns out he was dead right. He was absolutely right. So they had a meeting with the Deputy Chief of Intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Thomas Ray Wilson. They actually get to meet with him. And Wilson's boss, too, was there. And they're all in the meeting, and Greer does his thing. And at the end of the meeting, Wilson says, you know, I'm going to look into this. I'm going to see if there is a program. And then they go home. And Mitchell, he's the key in this, in my opinion. Well, Miller and Mitchell. So Wilson spends the next 2 months knocking on doors, going through files, and he finds not one, but four special access programs that seem to deal with ET tech reverse engineering. He finds one of them and talks to the three gatekeepers, as he called them, in charge of the program. The program manager, the security manager, and the corporate attorney. Because this is not DOD now, we're in private corporation. Probably Lockheed, no one's confirmed it. And Wilson's like, I need to be involved in this. It is your mistake that you're not allowing me to have oversight over your blah, 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 blah. And they're like, sure, fine, whatever. Yes, we're trying to reverse engineer a craft, not from here. We've made very little progress. You're not in. Don't try. Don't even think about it. And Wilson's like, oh, yeah, well, I'm going to get in. You just wait and see. And they're like, sure, knock yourself out. He goes back to Washington, starts complaining up the chain of command, and he's immediately threatened with his career. And he's angry, he's furious, but what can he do? So 5 years later, he's retired. In the meantime, Edgar Mitchell got word of Wilson's being shut out, and he talks to his buddies, which I affectionately call the Bigelow Club. All around Robert Bigelow in the National Institute of Defense, National Institute of Discovery Science, back in the late 90s, early 2000s. So you've got Robert Bigelow, you've got Hal Puthoff, you've got Kit Green, you've got John Alexander, you've got even Jacques Vallée is part of that whole group, you've got Eric Davis, Colm Kelleher, and so forth. And Mitchell got word of this, and he tells them. He said, well, yeah, Wilson got denied. Wow, amazing. Because that whole group of people, like now, I know this now, like this is my own figuring this out, but they are a brilliant group of people with various security clearances and with a fascination to the point of obsession at times about UFOs. All of them, every one of them, because they all know it's real, they all know it's important, and they all want to get to the center of the labyrinth. And so what they would do is share what they know with each other in a secure way, in a way that's not violating, their own security clearances, but that's what they all did. So Mitchell comes back, he gives a report on Wilson, and when Wilson retires 5 years later, they send one of their own, Dr. Eric Davis, to go off and interview Wilson and get the real scoop. And Davis met with Wilson and hit a home run interview and took 13 pages of detailed notes, and Wilson just unloaded. Now, I don't know if Wilson, I'm sure, did not tell everything. In fact, Davis asked a lot of questions, and Wilson just said, nope, can't tell you, core secret. What was the company? Can't tell you, core secret. Core secret means if you give that up, that's like catastrophic failure. You can't do that. But Wilson told him enough, and was quite upfront. And how do I know this is real? Well, I know it's real because in 2006, I was shown several pages of those by one of the people in that club. And I've never given up the man's name, and I won't. I begged him when they leaked out in 2019, like, can I please mention the fact that it was you who showed me these? And he said, I'd rather you not. So I'm not going to. That's fine. I was disappointed for a while, but it's okay. Meanwhile, you got a lot of loudmouth people out there saying, it's fake, it's a psyop, it's like the Majestic documents. No, it's real. It's absolutely real. And by the way, a number of prominent researchers and the like have said to me privately, oh yeah, I've seen them too. I saw them years ago. Like, everyone knows they're real. But like, these people cannot possibly admit it, because if they did, they'd blow their security clearances and bad things happen in one way or another. They just can't do it. And so here we are. But UFO researchers should know better. And by the way, when you study those documents, all right, they are among the best things that we have actually to help us navigate that structure of secrecy. Because there's a lot of bureaucratic stuff in there that's actually very useful, and some good names to go by as well. There are research leads that are in there. And I talk with some of the researchers, and we're trying to go through those leads. Anyway, that leaked. And then all these other things that leaked during 2019, 2020, 2021, it's like amazing. Another New York Times article in July of 2020, that was a good one. That took us, again, Leslie and Ralph, right to the edge of crash retrievals. You get a statement by Eric Davis in that article and a statement by Harry Reid in that article. Harry Reid had to walk it back in a tweet. Harry Reid is almost like our new version of Buzz Aldrin. He says like these amazing things, and then the handlers come in the next day and say, sir, you've got to you have to issue a denial of that. And Harry Reid issues a tweet saying, no, I didn't mean to say that there's definitely crash retrievals. What was I thinking? In the New Yorker article in May 2021, this year, same thing with Harry Reid. He's talking about Lockheed and getting denied access to the Lockheed Special Access Program. If you read that article, very interesting article in the New Yorker. And then the next day or day after that, Reid tweets again. He says, no, I didn't say that I think it's Lockheed. I don't think so. Other people may think that, not me. It's like, okay. I'm sure the New Yorker journalists really screwed that one up, but okay, whatever. And then the last bit of news was just less than a week ago, I guess. Yeah, about a week ago. New York Times again. Actually, the New York Times did 2 more articles on UFOs. These were very, very tepid, and I would say below average. Now we're getting back to the standard level of the New York Times. And why? Because these are not by Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal. That's why. So this is by Helene Cooper and Julian Brown. What an embarrassing article this one was. And there was another one they did the same day that was actually even worse. But in this article, a couple of times the authors explicitly state, well, UFO doesn't necessarily mean alien. Okay, yeah, we get that. And then the other article from the New York Times that day was even worse. It was like, here's a little history of UFOs. We're not going to talk about crash retrievals or Roswell. We're not even going to talk about Project Blue Book other than just passing over it. And it was an awful article. And that leads me to my conclusions here. What we've had in the last 3.5 years since all of this has happened is no one really knows what to make of these revelations. Everyone argues in our community over what's TTSA? Are they a CIA PSYOP, or are they military intelligence PSYOP doing a false flag? You hear that a lot. And some people even will talk about the famed Project Bluebeam in connection with all of this. So Bluebeam, if you don't know, that actually was originated as an idea in 1994. And as a fake alien invasion, scare the hell out of you type of thing, you go run into PAPA, that is a national security state for protection, and they'll do a totalitarian lockdown in exchange for protecting you from the aliens. Like, that was supposed to be the Bluebeam. Holographic display, and of course what you should know is that Bluebeam originated primarily as an evangelical Christian idea. So it would be a second coming of Christ in the Western countries, and then there'd be holographic displays of other religious figures in other nations. Like, how in God's name are you going to do that? I have no idea. Fake archaeological finds were supposed to be discovered that would throw people off from the true faith. And yes, aliens as well. That was all in the mix. The guy who came up with this was a French-Canadian from Quebec named Serge Monast. And I don't even think he spoke English, but he had a connection at NASA. He said that NASA and the UN were plotting to do this all before Y2K in 2000. And, I mean, if you ever read Monast, and I did this for you so you don't have to, but I'm just going to say he wasn't all there. Just as like unhinged, in my opinion. But anyway, so blue beam didn't happen, and then it morphed into an alien invasion scenario in the 21st century. And like even back in 2010, there was supposed to be a blue beam event, and I'm like rolling my eyes, telling people it's not going to happen, it's not going to happen. And now you're hearing it again. A lot of people talk about it. Anyway, back to the revelations. False flags, PSYOP, what's happening? It's very, very common to hear people say that all the information coming out, courtesy of people like Lou Elizondo, Christopher Mellon, and the like, is a PSYOP in one way or another. Well, let me get into the false flag thing first, because people like to use that word. And so happens that false flags are a very strong interest of mine. I nearly wrote a book on the history of false flags. I did write a TV series for Gaia on the history of false flags a couple of years ago. My producer for that should be in the audience, Sid Goldberg. I love Sid. I gave Sid a lot of hell for things. It wasn't his fault. I threw a lot of hissy fits during that. But anyway, Sid stood by me. And so we did that. And I'm very engaged in studying false flags. And I happen to think that we live in an era of false flags. And I've developed my own theory about false flags, like my own modality of them. And I think I'm right. Anyway, one of the things about false flags is you have to dominate the media. And you have to have a coordinated media response, like swift, powerful, unified media response to get an immediate reaction out of you so that you allow the government to do something that they couldn't ordinarily have done, whether it's pass pernicious laws to take your freedoms away or maybe invade that country over there because we want to do that and we need a justification. And in other words, the media response has to be coordinated. It's got to be powerful. And it's got to be in your face. Well, we get none of that with this. We get none of that. There's no coordination going on here with this message. People say, well, there's a threat narrative. Elizondo keeps talking about a threat narrative. He's trying to scare the public. Well, let's just stop and talk about that. Seriously. I showed you some documents earlier about the perturbing nature of these objects. Now, it's true, there was no Independence Day scenario. These objects weren't blowing up the White House. They weren't using lasers necessarily to shoot our aircraft out of the skies, although there's a lot of provocation. When you go through the history of UFO encounters with militaries around the world, and also commercial aviation, let's not forget that. There's a lot of close encounters and dangerous events going on. Doesn't mean that they're hostile, but if you're a military person, and if you are responsible for the security of a sensitive base, for example, and unknown objects are hanging out over your base, objects that don't look normal, that don't act in any conventional way, that are extraordinary, yeah, you're going to be kind of concerned about it, and you would be criminally negligent if you did not consider it a potential threat, because that is your job. So unless you don't think that the military has a right to defend your nation or to defend their airspace, then I don't see what the argument is to say that it's unfair to talk about a potential threat, because it is a potential threat. Like, that's the reality. Doesn't mean that they're necessarily actively out to harm us. I mean, after all, they're hanging out over at the Hanford Atomic Energy Plant. Yeah, that was a huge toxic boondoggle. And people in 1950 probably had no idea how bad it was going to be, and probably aliens would. So they may have been concerned. Fair enough. Nevertheless, it is legitimate, I would say, to at least consider that these are a potential threat. And I think otherwise just foolhardy silliness. So there's that. The other thing about potential threat, I would just say, is, look, you're trying to talk to dumb Congress, dumb media, lazy, ignorant people who really just don't care about any of this stuff. How are you going to get their attention? Like, honestly. Well, maybe you have to shake them by the shoulders and wake them up and say, there's a potential threat here, which is actually a legit thing to say. It's what I did in my first 2 volumes of history, UFOs and National Security State. I don't think I did anything different, frankly. You point out that this is a serious matter, and that's exactly what they did. So I don't consider the threat narrative a valid argument to say that this is a PSYOP or false flag to make you justify greater military expenditures, which, by the way, none of the UFO stuff, to my knowledge, has been a significant impact on military spending. Maybe in the future it will, could happen, but so far it's been 3.5 years. I don't see anyone running around scared either, by the way. I don't see a frightened public. In fact, I see the opposite. The primary media message is not threat. Once in a while, Elizondo, particularly Lou Elizondo, will mention that. But you really don't get a threat narrative coming out of the media. It's not happening. And this last New York Times piece, absolutely they play it down. So if they're trying to ramp this up, they're doing a pretty bad job at it, I would say. And there's not coordination either. So like between, say, the New York Times and Fox. So over at Fox, they got really one guy, Tucker Carlson, who seems to have an interest in this. And he actually asks, I mean, for major corporate media, relatively decent questions. Got to give the guy credit on that. I mean, he's actually at least going in and trying to get to this. But there's no one else in the major television media that I recognize is actually even a fraction of the way that far down the road. And the New York Times, by the way, this is the last thing I'll say this before moving on. When the New York Times first did their few articles back in 2017, like a lot of us were wondering, like, what's actually going on? Because we were all used to knowing that the New York Times is the premier source of fake news. Everyone talks about fake news. No one's better than maybe CNN. All right, I don't get political here. But let's say New York Times. That's a safe bet. New York Times has measurably given out fake news that's resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people. You've got, weapons of mass destruction. And by the way, the New York Times is very complicit in the false flag anthrax scare. And yes, I will say that was an absolute false flag. New York Times was absolutely on board with that nonsense. So no, all of a sudden the New York Times is now doing something decent on UFOs. Well, no, a lot of us were inclined to wonder what's going on. But what I believe now is that there is one and only one reason that the New York Times did anything halfway decent on UFOs. Actually, two reasons. And those reasons were called Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal. Those are the two reasons. And I believe that Leslie and Ralph fought their way to get those articles published. And I know they had resistance. Why else in the first article where they're talking about, I forget it was the ATIP or the Tic Tac article, but they bring in James Oberg, one of the most prominent skeptic debunkers, and they bring in a completely irrelevant, useless quote by Oberg to, why? There's no point. Does anyone really think Leslie or Ralph wanted that in there? They're both UFO believers. We all know that. There's no reason that they would do that. They had to. Because they had to fight an ultra-conservative establishment in that organization. They had to do it. But they were able to get some very good articles in the Times, I mean, by corporate mainstream standards, of course. And when they were not the authors, the New York Times reverts back to its substandard, less than mediocre levels, which is really where they're most comfortable. So I think that's the story. So what I'm saying to you is that we're dealing with a situation where there are two forces at work in what we're dealing with right now. One force seems to be doing what it feels it can to promote a greater openness on UFOs. I don't know about disclosure, full disclosure, I doubt it, but more openness on UFOs than we have had hitherto. There's a fancy $10 word. And then the other force, I'm going to talk about that too. It's a force leading toward greater global secrecy on UFOs and, let's say, 24/7 global totalitarian conformity. Those are the two forces, and they are at odds with each other. Let's talk about force number one, the faction within the establishment. There's Robert Bigelow, leader of the club. I've never talked with him. I would love to talk with this man, I have to say. So what I believe, this is my take, some of you will disagree, I have no doubt, it's fine. I don't get offended. I was saying to someone earlier, like, you have to work really, really hard to get me mad at you or offended. I don't get personal about any of this stuff. I think it's a bad idea, by the way, for people to get personal in this field, and it happens all too much. But force number one is a faction. And I think the members of the core group, let's just throw the names out there. You got Bigelow, you got Harry Reid, you got Hal Puthoff, you got Eric Davis, Lou Elizondo, Christopher Mellon, Tom DeLonge, George Knapp, Leslie Kean, Ralph Blumenthal. There's others, but that's probably the big ones. We should put Danny Sheehan in there now. There's Danny. He belongs in there. He does. He belongs in there. And this group has allies. Yes, they do, within the Pentagon and beyond. Tucker Carlson at Fox, he's an ally. There's some UFO researchers who are allies. And there's a lot of other, there's lower level media, some prominent YouTube personalities and like semi-establishment news organizations. Over at Rising on the Hill, you've got Sagar Enjeti, who he's a young journalist, very kind of like mainstream political. He's into it. He follows the UFO news, and they're bringing this to a broader public. So there's definitely people, you got Rogan, you've got a number of other people who are, Lex Fridman over on his big YouTube channel, he talks about these things. So there's like a kind of just below the biggest, but some of these people are bigger than the corporate establishment anyway. They have more followers. But there are also enemies to this faction. That's the real establishment. They're the enemies. They're not the same as the faction. So who's the core public group? I say public. The people that we can see. Well, the Pentagon PR desk, they're an enemy. That's for sure. New York Times, other than Leslie and Ralph, when they're not involved, New York Times is part of that establishment. And most of the rest of major media is part of that. And there are some UFO researchers who very loudly proclaim their enmity to all things having to do with this faction. And then behind the scenes, factions, the enemies are even stronger, because that's everyone associated with the special access programs, the private contractors involved in this, the big corporations. Probably most of the senior members of the Pentagon, I mean, these people don't like to give up secrets ever, ever. It's against their DNA. And they are not friendly to this stuff. Mark McCandlish, rest in peace, a man whose death is very suspicious, was deathly afraid of this group. And I know this because, and I will release this sometime soon, but a very close friend of mine, an associate of mine, had a very extended correspondence with Mark McCandlish, which I have, and it's quite fascinating. He was terrified of the private contractors, particularly, who he believed were not averse to killing problematic individuals. Anyway, be that as it may, the real establishment, they are not friends of disclosure. They are not interested in any way of raising awareness about UFOs at all. What does this establishment want? Well, this is where it gets really fun. Actually, not fun. My view is they will stall on UFO disclosure indefinitely. If they can hold off disclosure for 5 years, they'll do it. If they can hold it off for 50 years, they'll do it. If they can hold it off for 500 years, they'll do that too. They probably can't do it for 500 years, but they'll do it as long as possible. And, but beyond UFO disclosure and secrecy, they've got other interests, that's for sure. So what we're looking at is the transformation of our globe right now. We all know it. We have all seen it in the last year and a half. It started in earnest really after 9/11, but that was, I guess we can now look back and say that was phase one. Now we're going through another phase. And what we're looking at is the development in inevitable, well, maybe I shouldn't say inevitable, a seemingly, possibly inevitable development of a global totalitarianism. Digital control over your speech, over the expression and flow of ideas, over your movement, over your employment, over your entertainment, over your culture, over your information, all of that. People talk about fascism and they think about it in connection with a dominant fist on the table leader. That's why they talked about Trump or comparing him like Mussolini and that type of thing. I'm going to tell you right now, that's not fascism. Cult of personality is now irrelevant to fascism. Got to understand that. In the 1930s, yeah, it was the way. And it was, you look at the fascists of that era, and let's include the communists and Stalin, absolutely. That was creation of a quasi-religion, absolutely, with the rituals, the fancy gaudy uniforms, the pageantry. It was important to do that. And it's not that it's not important today, but what's much more important is digital control. That's really what matters. Bureaucratic control over every single aspect of your life for the rest of all time. You don't need a cult of personality for that. You don't have to have this loud trash talk and nationalist to be a fascist. That's complete. It's like, don't get caught up in thinking that's how it has to look. It's irrelevant. And the other thing that's not needed anymore, unfortunately, is an industrious middle class. That's very bad news for us. Middle class as a phenomenon is a historical blip. You know, it really started in the 18th century, basically, with this crazy new thing called free enterprise capitalism, where individuals had the freedom to create their own economic future. That was a completely new thing at the time. And it was actually tremendously beneficial, even to the people at the top of the pyramid. Why? Because all those little busy beavers were liberated to unleash their own genius to create new things, to make the world a better place. And they did. They invented, you know, the railroad and the telegraph and then the automobile and the car and like all these crazy cool things that the Rockefellers and the Morgans and all the Rothschilds and the masters of the universe were like, wow, this is actually really nice. Thanks, little people. I'll take your invention. So it was necessary. You had to have and to have a free enterprise system like that, you had to have a culture that embraced some level of freedom. It was necessary. But I will ask you to consider how necessary is that today, now, in an era in which intelligent algorithms increasingly are going to take your job because you're not going to be needed that much. Yeah, there'll be some need for some very inventive people, absolutely. But we're developing a global system that is so bureaucratized and in which the levels of control have to be higher and higher, but the freedom of the genius of people to express, like that's just, it's really not as necessary anymore. That's the truth. So we're becoming superfluous. I liken it to a game of musical chairs. You know, you have all the kids in the room and someone keeps taking the chairs out of the room and you still have the same number of kids. It's like, where are you going to sit? What are the jobs? What are people going to do? Well, the answer is there's nothing for them to do except, you know, take drugs and play VR games and, you know, watch whatever mindless entertainment is being given to them by the dominant culture. That's what's going to happen. And for those people at the very top, though, they will want what elites have always wanted but were never able to have, which is immortality, live 1,000 years, perfect health, live like the gods. They really do want this. They've always wanted it, of course, you know, unbounded luxury, all of that. They're going to get it, or at least they think they're going to get it. I recently, just a month ago, less than a month ago, I read one of the early futurist books, the early transhumanist books from 1968 by a man named Gerald Feinberg. He was a true definition of a crazed genius, both words. He was a genius, but he was insane. And he was like the godfather of people like Ray Kurzweil and the other singularitarians who are talking about, you know, the artificial intelligent explosion of which they're going to see conscious genius level AI. And what Feinberg was talking about in this book, back in the 60s, it's amazing. He was saying, you know, here's what we're going to do. We're going to create a future in which you don't have to work ever again. Robots are going to do everything for you. It's going to be liberal. This is like classic 1960s futurism. You ever watch those things like the Jetsons? But there's all these videos too. It'd be like the world of tomorrow. And, you know, dad gets to drive to work in a luxury car, sipping his martini. And the robot drives the car or it goes automatically. And his car's like a fancy living room. Go figure. Mom's still working in the kitchen, but the kitchen's set up with all the gadgets that do everything for her. Like, none of this stuff is practical, by the way. All these futures had no economic sense whatsoever, zero. But they had this complete utopian, scientific utopianism was the order of the day after World War II. And America was the king of scientific utopians, thinking, yeah, we're going to create this perfect future. It's going to be great. You don't have to work. Well, actually, you need to work. That's the thing. Like, you need to suffer. You need to suffer. You need to work. You want to become great, you got to suffer. Sorry, no other way. There's no other way. You got to struggle. But anyway, so they want to create a world without struggle. And here's Feinberg writing in 1968, and he's saying, like, yeah, we're going to create this futuristic society with, and he's talking about artificial intelligence, like solving all of our problems. And then he talks about, this is the creepiest thing. I cannot believe a man thought of this. He believed that you could take a little wire and put it in your brain. Think Elon Musk's Neuralink. This is like 50 years ago, this man's thinking of this. And he said, if you connect your consciousness to someone else's consciousness, how would you experience that? He believed, I don't know if he's right or not, he said he believed that you would experience it as one single unified consciousness. And he said, it'd be great, except there's two brains now. And he said, what if we did it to the entire human race? He was seriously suggesting this in 1968. Guess what world we're moving into? We're not that far. We're not that far. And I don't know if we're all going to experience a single Unitarian consciousness like a hive mind, but we're going to be getting kind of sort toward that. It's going to happen in one form or another. So, crazy stuff. In my last book, The Alien Agendas, I wrote last fall, I developed a theory which I call the fourth stage of humanity. And I just want to talk about that before I move into UFO disclosure. So what I believe is, if you look at the long history of our species, you know, when I was a kid, I read that the human race had existed for like 40,000 years, and the earliest version was Cro-Magnon man. Remember that, Cro-Magnon? A lot of us remember that. Well, actually, paleontology has made a lot of advances since then, that's for sure. And the number now is as far back as 315,000 years. The earliest truly human fossil, I think, is from northwestern Africa. And they're like us, more than 300,000 years ago. That may get pushed back further, you never know. But that's a long time. So during all of that time, nearly all of it, we lived in one and only one fundamental form of social organization. That was called hunting and gathering. That's how human beings lived. That's how we evolved. That's how our body plans were developed. That's how our brains evolved. The hunter and gatherer form of existence. And we did that for about 300,000 years. And only 10,000 years ago, we developed a new form, stage 2, which was agricultural revolution and domestication of animals. So we began to settle down. Out of that, only 10,000 years ago, starting, that's when you get the first cities. Only 10,000 years ago. That's when you get the wheel, and you get writing, and you get metallurgy, and all the things that we consider civilization. It's very recent. We forget, you know? Everything from ancient Egypt to the Roman Empire to the Italian Renaissance, all of that is stage 2 of human civilization. And it's amazing. That was an amazing form of civilization, absolutely. High level of organization, literacy, sophistication, proto-science. In fact, the beginnings of science happened then. And that's what took it to stage 3, is science and then industry, a couple of hundred years ago. Let's say 17th century, 18th century, you know, guys like Descartes and Isaac Newton, and then the British industrialization that followed as a result of that transformed our world again in an absolutely equally profound way. You know, and there's all variations of these, but they're really, in my view, they're fundamentally of a kind. And we were all born into stage 3. We were born into the late stage industry and science. But now I propose we're moving into a fourth stage. I don't know what to call it. Maybe the transhumanist stage. Maybe the 24/7 global digital surveillance stage. I don't know. Maybe the humanity as one big ant farm stage. Maybe that's the way you call it. But whatever it is, it's something totally different. And I mean, think about it. So we're going to have strong AI, biogenetic engineering, nanotechnology, highly advanced. You've got quantum computing, and oh, don't forget 5G and smart devices. That's key. That's key. Because with the smart devices, they can only work with 5G. But what they'll do is they've got the little sensors and monitors, and they'll just watch every single thing you do, you know, from your toaster to your toilet to your refrigerator. Like, they'll know what you're eating, that's for sure. But they're going to know more than that. And everything that you do will be collected, crunched, tagged and bagged, and then some algorithm will do a Minority Report style predictive modeling of your behavior, better than you could do yourself, probably. And all of that's happening. So in that world, And that's the bare bones beginning. Like, that's a fundamental transformation of how human beings exist. And to my mind, it's, I'll check out before that happens. Thank you very much. I have no interest in that world. But it's happening, it's coming. We got to figure out, if you don't want to be part of that, you better figure out a way to deal with it, because that's now. We're just beginning that stage. The mature stage will probably maybe be a century from now, but we're entering it now. Now, at the bottom of this slide, I say why our society will achieve parity with extraterrestrials. That's kind of a provocative thing to say, I admit. Why would I say that? People would say, well, we can never catch up to the ETs. They're eons ahead of us. How could we? We must be like insignificant ants to them. Wrong. Dead wrong. Because progress doesn't go incrementally like this. It doesn't go like that. It goes like this. It goes by jumps and leaps. All right? That's how it works. Through scientific revolutions. There was a book by that name, by Thomas Kuhn, many years ago, where he coined the phrase, the word paradigm, as a matter of fact. But what he was saying is that our progress goes by revolutionary, paradigmatic changes. And I think that's absolutely true. And what if what we're approaching now, in this fourth stage that I think is happening, is a plateau in which certain critically fundamental foundational sciences become known to us, and those are the keys to the kingdom. And what if they're the same keys that other species have right now? So they may be at a more advanced stage of stage 4, but maybe some of them are right at that stage. It's totally possible. So we may actually be leaping into their world right now. And that's what I mean by parity. And if that is the case, then you got to assume they know this. And then you got to assume we might be a problem for them. Or we might be a prize, one or the other. We might be a problem because, we're kind of aggressive, we're kind of creative, we got a lot of innovation, and we like to throw our weight around a little bit, and we might disrupt whatever it is they've got. I don't really know for a fact, but my own theory is that they probably are very conservative societies. And I think that because it's very possible that they are even more controlled and hive-minded than we are. I think some of the descriptions certainly lead reason to think that. And I don't think that they do a lot with change at this point. And well, that's what we're all about. So we're moving in, and we're an unstable part of the equation. So if I were them, I might be wanting to look at humanity thinking, well, we want to monitor and maybe manage this process. How do we do that? And that's just something you want to think about. I think it's entirely possible. Again, I'm just speculating. I could be wrong. I've been wrong about a lot of things, but it's just an interesting idea. I can't shake it. I keep trying to shake it. I want to think of other options, but I keep coming back to that. So anyway, that's what we're moving toward. Yeah, it's a phase that I'm not a fan of, but I don't know. The other thing that I'll just say is, I was going to save this for the end, and I'll come back to it, but it could very well be that we are turning ourselves into the very aliens that we observe. Like, that's a real possibility. I mean, hive mind, total monitoring. I mean, you get the descriptions that people say about these other aliens, particularly the Greys, and you get this sense of hive mind and, telepathy, where they all seem to know what each other's thinking. Maybe there's some privacy, but you don't get the sense of that. Not at all. Could be exceptions, but it could be that we are actually becoming like them. And the one thing to think about is this by default? In other words, is this by the very structure of the technology that we've developed? Does that force us into this form of social organization? I personally have been a believer for a long time that your form of technology and let's say that are a huge factor in how your society is structured, and that it also creates the psychology necessary to make that society function. How much time do I have? 30? I am way behind. Oh boy, I did a bad. Thank you, Nikki. Whoops, is it that late? I'm pretty bad with this sometimes with my time management skills, and this is mostly a new lecture, and I didn't know how long it would go. So, all right, moving on. Back to UFOs. I wanted to get into that whole fourth stage of humanity just to give you an idea of like what we're up against, because that's the establishment, in my view. That's what they're pushing. They're pushing the 1968 vision of Gerald Feinberg in modern. You know, the people at Davos and the Bilderberg folks, that's what they're about, in my opinion. That's the world that they're trying to create, 21st century version of that. And that's a world in which you're not going to see a lot of openness and open, intelligent discussion of UFOs. Because an open, intelligent discussion of UFOs is going to cause some serious problems in terms of rocking the boat. We're moving into an era where you're not supposed to believe in conspiracy theories, right? Conspiracy theories are bad. Well, UFO cover-up is the mother of all conspiracy theories. Like, there's nothing bigger. Maybe 9/11. No, not even that. UFOs is the biggest. If that's ever acknowledged as real, like if the government says, yeah, we actually have been screwing with you all these times, all these years about UFOs, like that's just not going to go well. That's not what is wanted. So what is allowed in the current climate of UFO disclosure, and what's the red line or the red lines? In other words, what are the lines you're not supposed to cross in terms of public conversation? Well, let's get into it. So what's permissible? Well, where we're at right now, which is basically, you know, Elizondo's great at these statements. There's something going on that we just can't explain. We don't know what it is, Tucker. Could it be the Chinese or the Russians? Well, maybe not, but what if? Like that type of thing. This little pretend game that we don't know what it is. I mean, of course he knows what it is. All those folks know exactly what it is. They just can't say it because they got security clearances and they've got to deal with this establishment. They're scared. It's really simple. So we're at this level. There's something going on we can't explain. Keep in mind, we were not even there more than 3.5 years ago. This is an amazing place for us to be as a society, and it's just baby steps. But it's still like an amazing place to be. So that's where we are. That's what's allowed. Are we going to get to other places? Oh yeah, right here. This is a step beyond where we used to be. Step one, you could say, was it's all BS. And step two is, well, some of it's classified military. And that's really where we were. Now we're at step 3 of disclosure, which, yeah, there's something happening. We just have no idea. Well, there's a lot of other stages ahead of that. I'm going to talk about them in a minute. We're in this weird in-between stage right now. We're in this kind of quasi, like sort of admission, you know, where the Navy has said, yeah, we got these UAP. Not the president, not the White House, the Navy. It's important, but it's not, it's everything where we've come to can still be walked back, even now. There is no necessary inherent reason why we're going to keep going forward in this. You know, this whole thing can go back. And in fact, that last New York Times article looked to me that it was a walking back, potentially. And maybe the UAP task force, when it is out soon, that might be a walk back. I don't know. I have no idea what's in that thing. But it could be. So anyway, future fallback positions or future levels of disclosure. If you're the establishment and you're on a retreat from the enemy, that is the people pushing this, you got a lot of fallback positions before you really have to worry. Let's look at them. Fallback position number 1 is, yeah, lately we've actually had quite a few encounters with these things. We're kind of there. We're actually sort of there. We're getting there. You know, and the UAP task force supposedly has got something like 120 encounters. Of course, that's nothing. But to say they had 120 encounters over the last 20 years, you know, they're inching up there toward having a lot of encounters. Next layer, or fallback position, was we actually have studied some unusual artifacts. Yeah, we actually have. We don't have any conclusion. We're working on it. Like, that's an easy one. Another one. Well, some of these UFOs may have come from elsewhere, but we don't know anything about them. Now, that's an interesting place, and we're edging toward that, but we're not there officially. But that is a place that they could go to at some point, and that's still a safe place. That's still a safe place. Because it's may have come. Yeah, we think they may have come from somewhere else. We just don't know anything about them. Next layer of defense. Well, we actually have known something about this for a little while, but we kept it quiet because we didn't want to panic the public. So again, no culpability. Next, well, we have had military encounters actually for years, but we still don't know much about it. Or we've secretly tried studying this for years, but with little progress. Or we've recovered craft, or maybe even bodies, but with little progress. We just don't know, and we don't want to panic the world. Or, of course, each step you're getting into a harder and harder place to defend without it avalanching on you. I mean, that's always the danger, too. Let's keep that in mind. As we keep going, these are less secure positions. But nonetheless, this becomes the new Alamo, the new place where you make your last stand. Next is, yeah, we actually have had a long-standing cover-up. We actually have, but all in the name of public safety. Yeah, we've had extreme secrecy. Yeah, there have been men in black. Yeah, there's been corporate involvement. Yeah, Lockheed and the rest. And yes, our institutions have been totally corrupted. At this point, it's going to start to fall apart, probably. Then you have admission of major breakthroughs, let's say breakaway technology of this sort or another, anti-grav, free energy, whatnot. Then an admission that, well, we actually know quite a bit about them. Thank you very much. Yeah, we know who they are and what they're all about. Oh yeah, abductions are real. Oh yeah, consciousness is actually super important in all of this. And we've actually didn't want you to know that because, well, that's kind of a useful thing for you to know, and we just didn't really think anyone was ready to know some of these secrets. Or another admission, and this is all hypothetical, I don't know for a fact that these are true, but an admission that maybe one or more groups have, take your pick, infiltrated, monitored, manipulated us. And I think I have one more. Oh yeah, they're walking among us, and they are deeply embedded in our society. And I know that there's people probably right here who believe that's true. I'm one of them. I believe it's true. Can't prove it. But I've had too many stories, very believable, have come my way, and I'm just like, I give up. It's true. There are beings who look just like us, but they're not like us. What are they doing? Well, that's a whole interesting thing, isn't it? But they're here. Now, can these admissions happen? Well, I don't know. It could take a long time. You go all the way down that road. I think it's going to take years, if that, many years. Or can they be walked back? Yes, they can be walked back. I mentioned the problem with recognizing UFO cover-up a moment ago. It's the mother of all conspiracies. You admit that, then everything is open. I wrote about this in a book a little over a decade ago, AD After Disclosure with Bryce Zabel, and that was one of our main theses, which was simply that if you make this acknowledgement, you're going to open up a can of worms, and you don't know where you're going to come out on the other side of this. And that's not a place that elites like to be. Here's a question. Can you have disclosure without freedom? What I mean by that is we're moving into a world where we're losing our freedoms rapidly, like down a slippery, it's more than a slippery slope at this point. It's like a water slide. And if we lose more and more of these freedoms in the next coming decade, this decade, are we really going to be able to easily have genuine disclosure? I would just suggest maybe not. What's being hidden? I want to talk about this. Science is being hidden. Revolutionary transformations of our society through science is being hidden right now. I'll talk about, that's an illustration of the Tic Tac UFO. The conventional propulsion technologies cannot explain how these objects do it. Not just the Tic Tac, but all of them throughout the decades. We have no way to explain instant acceleration silently in the thousands of miles per hour. We just can't do it. Not using the conventional technologies we have. The accelerations, the right angle turns, all of that. The lack of a heat signature frequently from these things. So the question that I will ask you, and I don't have the definite answer because I'm not a scientist anyway, are UFOs manipulating the ether? And I know that's an old-fashioned term from the 19th century. Oh, it's been discredited. Well, I don't know about that. I'm not so sure it should be discredited. Or the zero-point energy field, or a superfluid medium to harness mass gravity and inertia, which is what scalar science really is all about. Because I think that may be in the cards. There's Mark McCandlish. So this is some of the private notes McCandlish wrote to my colleague, and I just want to talk about this, and I'm putting this out there. So McCandlish was quite convinced. So Mark McCandlish was an aviation illustrator who was one of the best in the world at what he did, and I think he's mostly famous for his illustration of the so-called ARV, the Alien Reproduction Vehicle, which was a story that came out from 1988 McCandlish had a friend named Bradford Sorensen, who is still alive. Sorensen is a high-level aviation industry executive. They were going to go to an air show in November 1988 in California. And McCandlish had a last-minute deadline. He couldn't do it. Sorensen goes with a senior defense official, friend of the family. They go. The official says, hey, I'm going to take you to an even better show. And they go and they fly to Lockheed's hangar known as the Big Hangar. And they go in, and there's like guards with M16s everywhere, and the defense official's like, whoa, I didn't think the security would be this intense. Don't say anything, I'll get you in. They go in, and on one side of the hangar, there's a big curtain dividing it. On one side are these losing prototypes, but really amazing aircraft, really cool stuff. On the other side of the curtain, Sorensen goes there, and he sees what he called, I think he called it the mama bear, papa bear, baby bear, hovering UFOs, hovering. And as he said to McCandlish, he says, I was pretty amped up. I was looking around. It was like a super shot of adrenaline. I looked for cables or ropes hanging, suspending these things. There was nothing. They were just floating. There was a general at a podium talking about them, calling them the alien reproduction vehicles, saying that this is 1988, that by then they'd traversed the solar system. And he said, when I looked at them, they looked like they'd been put through their paces, kind of beat up looking. He gave very detailed descriptions to McCandlish, who did a illustration that's out on the web. What McCandlish said privately is that one of the sources of his stated that the mercury isotope 199 was the key for working the, for creating the field that was necessary to do it. Mercury 199 is an isotope of mercury that, well, I'll just read here, and he's referring to the research of Victor Schauberger, if you know who he was, saying this was key to understanding how to tap zero-point energy from mercury 199 when subjected to high-voltage electrical discharges. The witness, this is Brad Sorensen, said those discharges were something north of over 1,250,000 volts. Isotope 199 is said to have an unusually high nuclear spin ratio. Brad said that one characteristic of mercury vapor from 199 was that it was a noble gas. In other words, that it was somewhat inert, which is important because you want it not to corrode the material that is contained within. So you want a noble gas or inert gas. Anyway, I'm just putting this out there because a lot of you are much more scientifically literate than I am, and mercury 199 is considered to be an important thing. McCandlish was terrified of talking too much about this. I will say that. This is a man named Kenneth Shoulders, who's not particularly well known, although he should be. He discovered and named these little objects called EVOs, which stands for exotic vacuum objects. And basically, this is important science, I think. And again, I'm not a scientifically highly literate person, but I try to understand these things. So what Ken Shoulders did, by the way, Hal Puthoff worked very closely with Ken Shoulders. Shoulders' work, I think, has been very important for a lot of people on the quiet side of things. But he proved, I'm going to read this, that a portion of a spark discharge consisting of ions and electrons coalesce into organized geometric structures. They self-organize, basically. And he called them EVOs, exotic vacuum objects. He discovered they're everywhere in nature. They are guided by the fields induced by their own motion. I have a hard time understanding this myself, so forgive me. But they produce anomalies. They can chew up matter. Think of the Hutchinson effect. John Hutchison over in, I think, in Vancouver, studied in great detail by John Alexander, one of the members of the Bigelow Club. That was an early version of the EVO phenomenon, I think, uncontrolled, where these some weird effects happen. EVOs can induce nuclear reactions. EVOs can nullify mass or inertia. If you scale up the effects of EVOs, they are analogous to those produced by UFOs. They have harmful radiation emissions, electromagnetic frequencies, violation of Newtonian physics, cloaking, and more. And if you scale up the effects of EVOs, they are now, oh, I said that. No, all right, so fine. Now I got the same thing I just said with a picture of a flying saucer. Mark McCandlish had this to say essentially about EVOs, and he connected it to Eric Davis, another member of the club. Davis was experimenting with mercury plasmas or virtual plasma conditions in a self-organizing vortex configuration like the central column of the ARV. He was all set to publish McCandlish is writing this. Word was he had found a way to tap zero-point energy, and then suddenly the paper was classified. Just interesting stuff to put out there. Can there be a breakthrough in secrecy and disclosure? So one problem facing the task force right now, at least this is the impression that we're all getting, the word is, let's say, first of all, do the people doing the task force even have the clearances necessary? Or can they even get them in time? 6 months is not a long period of time to get the clearances to go through that whole Pentagon, the Pentagon's maze-like structure. Probably not. I mean, really, probably not. Will they have an ability to get into Lockheed's bag of goodies? Certainly not. Or Boeing's or TRW's and all those other corporations? No, I don't think so. So despite any of the smoke that comes out, you're not going to get genuine confirmation. I don't think it's going to be happening for a very long time. I think we're going to be more in this nebulous, well, yeah, it looks like maybe, kind of, sort of, who knows, phase. There's Christopher Mellon. He had a very interesting statement. Christopher Mellon wasn't just in TTSA. He was, as I write here, he was a member of the General Senior Review Group of an organization called SAPOC. That's the Special Access Program Oversight Committee. That's one of the key things listed in the Davis-Wilson notes that I talked about earlier, where the secrets are kept, where special access programs in the Pentagon are monitored with basically no oversight. Mellon says this: if it were me and I were trying to bury it deep, I'd take it outside government oversight entirely and place it in a compartment as a new entity within an existing defense company and manage it as what we call an IRAD, or an independent research and development activity. And I just wonder, can most UFO reverse engineering programs be taking place in IRADs? Totally off limits from any kind of oversight. I'm going to guess the answer is probably yes, or something analogous to that. Is the window closing for us? We keep talking about the momentum. Disclosure is inevitable. It's not inevitable. I mean, it could happen, but it doesn't have to happen. You got big tech censorship, global clampdown of non-authoritative sources of information. I get dinged on YouTube all the time because of that. I'm not authoritative. You know, I'm not CBS News or whatever, and I'm not Snopes or what have you. We're seeing this happen all around, and it's really becoming a stifling environment, not just on YouTube, but pretty much everywhere. You've got deletion of social media, YouTube accounts at an alarming rate. You got manipulation of search engines. Google is absolutely dishonest algorithms in YouTube. It's ridiculous. YouTube, of course, is owned by Google. If you go to YouTube and you type in UFO, I mean, it's just absurdly bad now. It's horrible. For the last 5 years, it's just been bad to worse. You know, you get all corporate media. All the results, like all the actual interesting stuff is pages down. It's terrible. It's all intentional. I'm going to skip the rest of this. We're getting out of time. I want to look ahead to the world in just 9 years from now, 2030. What are we going to see in the world? Well, this is my thoughts. I think we're likely going to see a continuation in the greater and greater power of international bodies over national governments. I think we're going to see greater and greater global surveillance and control efforts by national governments over you through 5G, artificial intelligence, and all of that. There's no escape. It's going to be tough to escape. You got to really figure this one out. Greater control over public narratives in every possible function, every way. Elimination of the non-authoritative perspectives. One little interesting statement by Eric Schmidt of Google. He's talking about Google Echo. That's their version of Alexa, right? And this is a very interesting thing he said. It's like, what we want is that when you ask Google Echo a question, you get one authoritative answer. We want to make it easy for you. You think about how crazy and messed up that is. What kind of reality is so simplified that anytime you ask a question, you get one single answer? I mean, life isn't that way. Life is shades of color and gray and so forth. But what they're doing is training the next future generations to just expect a single answer. Don't bother with research. Just ask a single question. It'll give you the answer. You don't have to bother digging into the weeds of these issues anymore. Don't worry about your critical thinking skills. We're going to take care of it for you, give you the one answer. That was Schmidt's answer, and that's the world we're moving into. So we're taking away critical thinking skills of future generations, aside from raising them in the stultifying totalitarian environments in which kids don't even have the right to play freely without adult supervision anymore. You talk about a crime against future generations. How about putting that near the top of the list? My God. Greater control over public narratives, so I just said that. And then far greater ability to identify people via numerous technologies, facial recognition, voice rec. I mean, even beyond that, like, they'll be able to identify you by your manner of walk, your style of gait, or anything. The sky's the limit here. So you'll be tracked forever. And your kids and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. In the immediate future, I am personally someone who doesn't have a lot of faith in the global economic situation. I think governments around the world just printing money through oblivion. I can't see good coming out of that at any way and all. Ditto with the fact that 50% of all businesses that have shuttered during COVID are expected not to reopen ever. Talk about a body blow to the healthy economy. Everyone living on their STEMI checks and UBI, that's happening. Because the jobs aren't going to be there. They're just not going to be there anymore. And yes, I know, everyone says, well, we've heard this all along, and new technologies come along, and there's new jobs. But look, I'm sorry, I'm not buying this one. There's too many algorithms coming along to take away too many jobs, and I just don't think you're going to have enough positions to occupy people in any kind of meaningful way. I just don't see it happening. I'd love to be wrong. So what I'm saying is that for the next decade, we're going to see ongoing crises getting worse. The economic crises will exacerbate social crises, cultural crises, ideological crises, I hate you back, and so on. A breakdown of the culture. We have a broken culture. Culture's broken. Probably broke down 5-6 years ago, but I think it's just accelerated. For me, I think 2014, 2015 is when you could really start seeing it happen in a big way, to the point where, two sides hate each other so much. I mean, yes, there's always been the kind of arguments, but we're at a point now where the other side's now being demonized and almost literally dehumanized to a point that is frightening to me. It scares me to death. It's a bad situation to be in. Now, I do think in the UFO side of it, there's going to be more data that will be released. I think that there is enough momentum now that in the UFO side of it, we'll see increasing amount of information coming out. How much to push it over the edge, though, is the real question. Because as I was trying to explain, there are many fallback positions that the establishment can take to just delay this, like, basically forever, or close to, for a long time. And I'm sure at some point all of the truth will come out, because it will. You can't do it forever. But I believe that it's in the interest of the people running the show, whether they're all human or not, to delay this as long as possible. So it's also possible in the coming decade that we may have gotten to a point of no return within even the ordinary media. The media is controlled, but how fully controlled is it? I think we make a mistake when we think all of the media is always controlled. I think that's a simplistic way to look at it. I would say the dominant establishment media is basically controlled. Yes, for the most part. But even then, I don't think entirely. What we have to remember is no ruling elite is monolithic. It's never existed in history, not ever. Not in ancient Rome. You got Caesar against Pompey, against Crassus, and all the factions. They don't agree. No one agrees. And they don't agree now. In the history of UFO phenomenon, go back to the 1950s. Donald Kehoe, the great writer back then, wrote about all the factions that existed. There was a secrecy faction. Yeah, they were dominant, but there was also an anti-secrecy faction. High-level people within the Pentagon, within the military. They believed in breaking the UFO secret. They did. It's always been there. There's not, so it's, and within the media, there are, yes, most of the establishment media is not friendly, but some of it is. And they have to be careful, but it's not monolithic. All right, there are always splinter groups, always. So I think when there's always a danger of these knee-jerk reactions. Last thing I want to say, this is important for me, and I just want to share this with you. I feel that we've moved into a kind of very toxic postmodernist view of how we look at the world, and by that, and this invaded the UFO mentality. So what I mean by that is simply, in what we call postmodern poison, it's the poison pill for your mind. It's a situation where you deconstruct, really, the words that the other person gives you. What does that mean? Well, the implication is that whatever they're saying to you is really not what they mean. You got to figure out their secret motivations, what they're actually trying to say and do. Well, that's a great way to wreck a relationship. It's a great way to wreck a friendship, go on that assumption. And it's a great way to wreck a society as well, just going to say. Because what you're doing, you replace listening with suspicion. That's actually what you're doing. If you want to have a successful society, you got to listen to each other. You have to communicate, and you have to listen, you have to argue, you have to come to resolution, and you don't demonize the other person, by the way, because, you know, you're just as flawed as they are, and you just got as much black shit in your heart as they do. And never kid yourself. We all do. That's why we're human beings and not angels, because that's what we are. We're all flawed, limited human beings. But with a postmodernist attitude within ufology, essentially what we're doing is instead of listening to someone, we're like, oh, they're part of the Central Intelligence Agency, or they were part of the intelligence community, therefore we must never listen to them. Well, with an attitude like that, you will never get an inside whistleblower, ever. Like, don't even bother. You know, 10 years ago in our field, a lot of us would talk and think, wouldn't it be great if we had an inside government whistleblower? Wouldn't that be awesome? Well, now they come out and people are throwing rotten tomatoes at them saying, disinfo, liar, psyop, false flag. False flags happen. But like, you gotta listen to the information and at least take it in and test it, corroborate it. Ask yourself, is this true? Is this BS? Thank you. I got 5 minutes. Anyway, so I think that we've poisoned ourselves as a community because we don't listen. We just suspect. And the thing is, like, you got these people like, I know what their secret motivations are. Like, yeah, I can crawl inside that person's head, inside their soul, and I actually know what they're thinking. Sure you do. I know what they're... Testify. All right, let me get off my little hobby horse here. I am almost wrapping it up. I got to go fast. So, yeah, so we are moving things forward. Will there be enough to get to the actual red line of disclosure? That is admission of basically bodies, crash retrievals. Once you start admitting you got crash retrievals, you're going to have a hard time pretending that you haven't had a cover-up. You know, that's going to be the difficulty. And are we going to get there? I don't know if we're going to get there. I have no idea. We came really close last summer. Do we have enough? Well, I'm going to have to be quick here. Here's what we have to do. You want a real breakthrough, then some people are going to have to get really brave and maybe even a little reckless with their security clearances. They're just going to have to do it. They're going to have to step over the line and say what they know. Someone's going to have to do it. And no one's doing it over in that community. I think of Eric Davis, and I'm not calling him out. I respect Eric Davis. I think he's a brilliant man. And actually, he has a genius for saying everything that he can say without going over that line. He's really good at that. He's amazing at that. You go through all of his interviews, his statements, and you know he was partially read into a UFO special access program. And he stated this by a former executive vice president of a legacy aerospace corporation, probably Lockheed, who also saw a UFO with his family in the ocean near Sunnyvale, California. We know this because he said it. But Davis doesn't want to share this information in a manner that would threaten his clearance, anger the special access programs, or break confidences. I get that. We all get that. But someone's got to step over the line. And it's dangerous. So it's not for me to say, yeah, you should threaten your family and your career. But that's probably what's going to be needed. Because if no one does it, we're going to continue on to this system of legal illegality, which is what we've got. It's legal illegality. It's totally illegal, except they're allowed to do it. The way that the secret is hide. Secrecy is maintained, rather. So, black swan scenarios, there's a couple. I guess basically I just mentioned one. You know, someone just breaks their line. Someone just admits what they know. Could it be Colin Powell? Thomas Wilson? Any of the former CIA directors? Could it be General William McCaslin, he's another interesting guy? I don't know. Probably not, but things can come out of nowhere. Not everything is predictable. That's the great thing about living in 3D reality in a timeline where you don't know what's going to happen. We don't know the future. We're terribly bad at predicting it, myself included. There's a couple of scenarios that I see. Scenario one, let's say 10 years from now, is that the secrecy continues. How is that? Well, you'll have a continued slow drip of the evidence, and awareness gets raised bit by bit, but it doesn't force the powers that be into admitting to anything. That's where we are now, and I think that can continue for at least another decade, maybe more. It is possible. Here's maybe the one false flaggy, psyop-y aspect that some of the people claim that could be true, which is that awareness is raised enough of this phenomenon. We're starting to think, yeah, it looks like there's something there, that you might get some politicians saying, well, we need to raise the military budget to militarize space. Yeah, they might do that. It's possible. I don't know if that's a true psyop or not, or just opportunism, which is, I would say, it's more likely that. And then this, on the bottom, I think is the most important. The secrecy can easily be maintained by the continuation of the global system of control that's coming into place. You know, you maintain powerful control over all digital and private communications, et cetera, et cetera. You can do it. Now, scenario number two might be disclosure of some sort. Some significant sort. And it could happen. I mean, it's conceivable. The momentum that started can continue to chip away, and you know, one can lead to another. Someone else can be encouraged to come forward because someone else has done so. Yes, that can happen. It can happen, and it can start an avalanche effect, which is really was the theme of my book After Disclosure 11 years ago. I thought, you know, one big thing that comes out, it'll cause an avalanche. That has not happened. That was my false, I just assumed in 2010 that an avalanche would happen, and I was wrong. But it still can happen. And if it does, boy, duck, because it's going to get crazy. It'll be a crazy world. And we like to, you know, we have a lot of utopian tendencies among all of us. We want things to be all perfect and everything and solve our problems. We're never going to solve all our problems. I'm sorry, I'm one of those people. I don't believe we're going to solve all of our problems. And that's fine. We're not supposed to. You know, we're not gods. We're not transhumanist, forever living people. By the way, those transhumanists, they really scare me to death. You want to live forever, you'll lose your mind, I guarantee it. 150, 200 years, you're not supposed to live forever. You'll go insane. You will go insane. You're not designed to do that. We're just not. This is my opinion. Anyway, no utopia. Let's not fall into that, please. There will be dramatic consequences from disclosure, and some of them will be good, and some of them won't be good. That's life. Now, there is a worse scenario, what I call the unthinkable, but it isn't unthinkable. If in the next decade our society gets into some serious crisis action, you know, let's say Pakistan and India get into it, or South China Sea flares up, or, I don't know, some other crazy stuff happens, maybe in Eastern Europe, Donbass or Belarus or whatever. And, or you just have an economic collapse because we're on the precipice of that. I'm out of time. Thank you. Which would result in, you know, major unrest, totalitarian control, or even worse, who the hell knows. Or we have something better. I'm just about done. Thank you, Carla. We avoid a major collapse through some miracle, deus ex machina. God comes down and says, I'm going to fix everything. Yeah, maybe, okay. Or we are able to expose substantial elements of the secret, or and that results in a massive reevaluation of our society to some extent where we can fix at least some of our problems. We're not going to fix all of them. Never going to fix all of them. That would be great. That would be great. If we actually don't collapse, we don't fall into Mad Max, and we actually get maybe a transportation infrastructure back, or we get some other good things happening, and we can actually fix some things genuinely, I would consider that a major win. Bottom line, unprecedented challenges are ahead, great danger of a further broken culture. Maybe we can fix it. It's possible, I suppose. I write here, separated from our true nature and selves. Yeah, for me, like moving into a techno-dystopia, VR, augmented reality future, that's just the worst. Separate you from your inner self, your inner being. I'll pass. Isolated into our virtual worlds, ideological bubbles, propaganda 24/7, and mesh within a fictitious, controlled artificial world. Yeah, we all know. And what will happen if disclosure happens within that world? What if the aliens announce themselves through a virtual reality instead of, like, you know, in the flesh on a podium? I wonder if that will happen when everyone's like living in their Ready Player One world, you know? I don't know. And last question to think about, will we achieve disclosure just as we lose our old humanity and become the aliens that we've observed all this time? Or will we find a way to achieve meaningful public truth while maintaining freedom, dignity, and our fundamental humanity? That's the real question, because I'll tell you what I don't want. I don't want disclosure living in a totalitarian society where I'm digitally controlled.
What do we do?
Well, that's going to be my next lecture. So my websites are here. Oh, final question. How can we expect to come to an understanding of all the beings that are here? Because I haven't even talked about those guys. I wrote about it in the Alien Agendas. You can read that. It's on Amazon. Those that are physically here interacting in a covert manner with our society and our people. What are their motivations? What are their goals? What's their scale of operation? We don't even ask that question 99% of the time. I ask it sometimes, and I ask it in my last book. So those are just interesting things to ask about. They're not all discarnate consciousness entities. Some of them are physical, doing things right down here on the ground. And I'm not saying both types don't exist. I think both types do exist. But the ones that I'm immediately concerned with are the ones that are acting here in the flesh and in their tech. That's the ones I'm particularly concerned with. Those are my two websites, and I want to thank you very, 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 very much for being here. Thank you. God bless everyone here. Thank you.